Pomp and pardons. They assaulted police officers and then tried to overturn an election after the Justice Department's four-year effort to arrest, prosecute, and punish those behind January 6th. President Trump grants clemency or pardons to roughly 1,500 people. Among those, released former Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio and Oath Keepers founder Stewart Rhodes. They were convicted of orchestrating plots to stop the peaceful transfer of power. Executive action overload. Roughly 200 executive actions have already been signed, from a national emergency at the border to redefining birthright citizenship to restoring federal policy recognizing just male and female as genders and renaming the Gulf of Mexico. What happens next and the legal challenges this flurry of executive actions have already faced in court. I want to start tonight with Ed O'Keefe, who is joining us from the North Lawn of the White House. Oh, and Scott MacFarlane. I was told moments ago Scott would not be available, but you know Scott is always available. Scott, good to see you on Capitol Hill. Talk to us about the pardons and the reactions you have gotten today at the Capitol.
There's a mix of outrage and resignation about these pardons. Democrats and the victims, the police victims and staffers from January 6th, say this is a gut punch and also raises the risk of future political violence because it took away the deterrence and the moral hazard. Republican senators, we talked to many of them today. Some said they were surprised, but defended the pardons, saying Trump promised this on the campaign trail, Major. What's more, they say Trump, at some point, has decided that January 6th should be in the past and that people should look to the future. You're going to hear all kinds of defenses of this from Republican senators, but I can tell you, having talked to a number of them, Major and Ed, they were caught flat-footed, that it was a blanket pardon and not case by case and not judicious.
And Scott, I also saw in some of the Senate's comments from Republicans, well, Biden abused the pardon powers, therefore Trump is justified pardoning as he sees fit.
I talked to a dozen Senate Republicans today. Every single one of them drew an equation between the Biden pardons of January 20th and the Trump pardons of January 20th. It is clearly a synchronized message, or just a message they're easily able to synchronize on, because this all happened in such a short window of time between the two things. I mean, the Democrats would argue there's an asymmetry there, of violent insurrectionists versus protective pardons against those Trump has scorned, but the parallels are being made anyhow.
Ed O'Keefe, at the North Lawn of the White House, you talked to those who were close to President Biden in the waning hours of his presidency about these very family pardons. What did they tell you in defense of them?
Major, in the waning minutes, it was just 9 minutes to go in his presidency when we reached someone on the phone who explained to us that essentially, after hearing the threats of possible prosecution, or as they put it, prosecution or persecution of the Biden family during the campaign and in the weeks since during the transition, the president felt compelled to do this and had made the decision to issue those pardons in the last few days just before he left office. Sources didn't know whether the president's siblings, James, Frank, and Valerie, all of whom have been involved in his political career at various points in official and sort of unofficial, just, brotherly advice kind of roles, asked for those pardons, or whether the president just did it on his own. But either way, it was quite striking that literally at the moment he was being introduced on stage in the rotunda yesterday, the White House, as it was packing up, the Biden White House sent out one final note about those pardons. I think January 20th, 2025 is going to go down in history as a really tough day for the American justice system to see two presidents do this. In essence, trying to wipe the slate clean, either preemptively or after the fact, with things that are big parts of their legacy, or at least were big parts of the arguments against them from their other side and from their critics. And, to some extent, I think where Democrats are going to be frustrated is that, in essence, the outgoing president did, to some extent, at least present the talking point for Republicans that these are kind of now canceling each other out. And so maybe everyone should just move on. Plenty of people don't want to do that, don't believe that should happen. But the argument could be made now, because the former president did it, that perhaps they both have abused the pardon system. So game over, let's move on to the next thing.
Ed, remind the audience what, if anything, these particular family members within President Biden's inner circle might have reason to be afraid of, or the president might have been reason to be afraid of, in terms of investigation or possible prosecution.
So there's James, Valerie, and Frank. James had some questions about business work he had done alongside Hunter Biden at various times, and then some separate work he did for some healthcare entities in Pennsylvania. Had been subject to an investigation, no wrongdoing found, was also the subject of some congressional review as well at one time or another. But it was his work that was being investigated that allowed that Republican argument and label the Biden crime family to sort of develop, because well, it's not just Hunter, it's also his brother. And his sister Valerie, his brother Frank, at various times have either been in government or lobbying as well. Valerie is a pretty active and still engaged to some extent influence peddler, as many who are relatives of or close associates of well-known politicians become. Former staffers on the Hill head down to lobbying shops in downtown Washington, or in this case, the sibling of the offspring. For example, Susie Wiles, the new chief of staff, her daughter is working for a big Florida-based lobbying firm that just opened a D.C. shop to take advantage of the relationship. That's no different than what Valerie Biden, James Biden, and Frank Biden have done. Frank Biden was a Clinton administration official. Some questions about his personal life, but nothing that ever rose to congressional or criminal review. And again, it just, the fact that these pardons also go back to 2014 raised the question, what did they do in 2014? And I believe that's around the time there were some of the questions about what James Biden might have been up to. So again, just a striking, pretty galling move by the outgoing president, who of course did it similar to when he did the Hunter Biden pardon, in a way where he won't get asked about it, or there won't be an opportunity to ask him about it for quite some time, if anyone even remembers to ask him whenever they get around to interviewing him, which of course is such a rare thing.
Scott MacFarlane, back to you on Capitol Hill. Was there any sentiment expressed by senators today that the pardon powers, which you and I and anyone who pays attention to them often communicate, are basically unchecked where the president is concerned, that maybe Congress can or should do something to put some boundaries on the pardon power of a sitting president?
You have touched on the one issue that is bringing everybody together this day after Inauguration Day. I mean, first of all, you're talking about a power that Congress has no fingerprints on. They don't like that to begin with as a fundamental dynamic. But yeah, you just watched what I think Ed properly characterized as a day that will not go down in glory. January 20th, 2025, because of the pardons defining so much of the day, and to a degree, overshadowing a presidential inauguration, and an historic one at that. I think you'll find proposals that come out. If you can find a bipartisan nucleus to start, there'll be people who at least will informally indicate their support. But the complication there is, how do you get that past the finish line and not upset the sitting president, who is probably keen on using that pardon power a whole lot more over the next 4 years? It's an idea that has bipartisan spirit, but unless Ed and you see one, I don't, not a feasible road ahead for it.
Ed O'Keefe, back to you on the North Lawn of the White House. And some of the video that you've been seeing side by side with either Ed O'Keefe or Scott MacFarlane, some of the video you just saw with Scott was President Trump signing executive actions yesterday. Earlier, there was sidebar video of President Trump and J.D. Vance, the vice president, at a national prayer service at the National Cathedral. That was earlier today. Ed, on the question of immigration policy, a significant number of moves put into motion by President Trump last night.
Yeah, real quick, though, on the congressional thing, we were expecting to hear from the Speaker and the Majority Leader after they met with the President. The microphones were set up out here at the White House for them to take questions. We were called out to hear from them, and then suddenly we were told they're not coming out. Was that because they don't want to take questions on pardons? Was that because they don't want to take questions on some other matters regarding nominees that has come up this afternoon? Unclear, but there was an opportunity for them to potentially give a sense of where they'd like to go on that issue, and they took a pass. On immigration, you have seen today now several different entities in more than a dozen states essentially sue to start picking apart the immigration policy the president was putting in place with executive action. We're now seeing lawsuits challenging his decision to try to end birthright citizenship, which, let's remind the audience, is a constitutional right, something that was put in place by the founding fathers. He would like to end it. It will be challenged in court by all sorts of different entities and a handful of states saying it's unconstitutional. It puts a lot of different families at risk. You're also seeing today the Department of Homeland Security issue new guidance to its employees, making clear that one of its main objectives, if not the primary one, is to root out undocumented immigrants in this country, especially those that are a risk to public safety or national security, and get them out. And notably, they revoked a Biden-era rule that had stood for quite some time, even before that, that says so-called sensitive areas, churches, schools, hospitals, can be visited and entered by immigration agents if they believe somebody is being harbored in those locations. That decision will draw the ire not only of hospital companies and campuses and school districts, but also, frankly, the Catholic Church, which oversees all three types of sensitive areas: schools, churches, and hospitals. Cardinals across the country have signaled in recent weeks that they're concerned about possible changes. The announcement coming just a little while ago, likely to draw more specific ire from cardinals, including Cardinal Dolan of New York, who gave one of the benedictions yesterday at the inauguration. So it's a good reminder that while there were dozens of executive actions taken, hundreds, several of them, many of them, are going to result in legal action that delay their implementation if they ever get implemented. And several of them also don't take effect for quite some time. They were not immediate. For example, there's things in there about federal personnel that's going to require several months of review and then termination of employment potentially. Some of that can get challenged. Stepping out of the Paris Climate Accords of the World Health Organization, they've got yet another year before that can happen anyway. So the world has time to adjust to the United States not being involved in those types of things. But most of all, the litigation that he's inviting with this, and that those that help put those executive orders are provoking and eager to see play out, mean that it could be months, if not years, before some of these executive actions are ever enforced, or months or years before they're completely canceled out by courts.